information, and we really want TSDCA to be a resource for our membership so that they can not only receive benefits, but can also gain knowledge and new information. And so at one point a discussion came online, which was, what's the definition of a good associate? What is a good assistant? What is that? What's the difference between the two? What are they like? How do you build a team? So, and it was a really illuminating discussion, and I'm really excited to carry that over into this discussion here live and in person. So Jane asked me to do this, and I think it's worthwhile. How many people, for example, in this room have worked with Scott Lehrer at some point in their career? All right, great. All right, and how many people have worked with John Leonard?
It's at least 2.
Yeah. And then I think there's at least a couple of people who've worked with me at any point. Yeah? Oh, okay, got it. It's a shocking number. Okay, great. And Annalee, does anyone work with Annalee? Okay, excellent. And Alex? Yes, there you are. All right. So it turns out we all have worked with each other and know each other well. So that's great. But I think it also illustrates what a small world this is and how interconnected a lot of our relationships are as sound designers. And part of TCA's mission is to bring us all together in a more formalized way so that we can share information. So I'm going to open this up right off the bat and just say, what makes a good associate designer? What are the qualifications of a person who's a good associate? So I'm just going to turn to John. John, what do you think?
Most of the work I do, because it's so appallingly badly paid, I can't afford an associate, but I do have one at the moment because I'm here, and actually I ought to be in rehearsals in London. But my associate there is a lady who I work with for some considerable time, doing shows at the National Theatre, and she thinks the same way that I think. That's the most important thing, in my view, as an associate, in that she knows the way that I like to work. She knows as we've already discussed yesterday, my slightly peculiar working practices, and she knows how to, not necessarily pretend how to be me, but she can fill in for me, and she can also do the things that I'm not good at, which is mostly arguing with people. She's really good at that. And I think that's one of the things that you need. It's also one of the things that when I first came over, you guys will remember I was really, really bad at stating my case, and really quite surprised at how forcibly my American associates stated my case for me to producers. And it meant I got results that I kind of wasn't expecting to get, which was a really nice thing to do. It also means that I can relax and concentrate on what I'm supposed to be doing, which is to have an interaction with the director and anybody, composer and anybody else I'm working with, and knowing that there's backup covering the stuff that kind of is in the back of my mind. So I guess one of the things you need in a good associate is a mind reader, but it's something that develops over time, and it's not something you can just say, yeah, I think you'll be okay as an associate. I've never done that. It's always been through either personal recommendation or somebody I worked with in another capacity who I've discovered that during the course of working with them that we actually think the same way. So that's my main criteria for finding an associate, is that somebody who thinks like me.
That's great. Annalee, do you ever have that thing that you realize you need to be a mind reader in order to be an associate? Like, does that come up as part of your experience?
A little bit, but primarily on our team on Hamilton, we all have very designated roles, and what we find is that sometimes you have to pick somebody else to fight a particular battle, somebody who's more equipped just personality-wise, or gels with certain people in a more effective way. And that's something that I find we're navigating a lot. And sometimes as an A2 on Hamilton, I'm interacting with other groups of people, or the management teams or other departments, in a way that would just be more efficient because the way our personalities gel. So not necessarily mind reading, but again, a fit. I'm just trying to be an extension of the arm of the design team, and that's what I find I have to do.
That's great. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. So Chris, you have been on both sides of this, both as a designer and as an associate. Have you learned things being on both sides of the coin that has given you additional perspective? Like when you've been in the design position, are there things that you learned being an associate that you're able to then use to translate to the people you work with?
Absolutely. If Scott is a regular Broadway designer, I am a very irregular Broadway designer in that most of my work actually is as an associate doing Broadway shows. And I've probably done somewhere around 50 Broadway shows as an associate for about 20 different designers. So you have to be somewhat of a chameleon. For each designer, you have to assume their individual perspective and their working style, and you have to understand where you can suggest and where you have to lay back and use auto continue groups. Michael, right? Yeah. Where is he? No. But I think what I've learned from watching all of the designers I've been fortunate enough to interact with is actually well, Broadway associate design is actually far more 75% of a mechanical process and 25% really interesting. There are just some mechanical things that you simply must do to make a Broadway show go, and a lot of those things don't really exist outside of the silly little sphere of Broadway. As long as you take care of all of those things, then the 25% of the job becomes the interesting part. And as an associate, what I've constantly learned every single time with working with a new designer and is watching their interactions with the design team, the rest of the design team, the director, with the play, and getting a sense as to, for my own work, where I would feel comfortable and be interested in going in a similar situation. And sometimes, if you have that relationship with your designer, you can lean over and say, have we thought about doing this? And then letting it, and then if you can prosecute that more, or if you can really start to poke them and go, we really should do this. And then sometimes, when you look over and you get the look, you're like, okay, but I'll just do it that way. I recently worked on a show where I swear to God, I despised the show, and everyone else in the world loved it. Everyone was telling me, oh my God, it's fantastic. And I just thought, this is just not my cup of tea. The fucking drum just keeps going tink, tink. Never would have done that in a million years. But it took me, I had to really work as the associate. I had to really work to be able to stand up and put myself in the headspace of the designer, in the headspace of the aesthetic of the show, and try to support it in the best way it could be supported. And, and what I took from that was next time I worked with that same designer and the same team, I found strangely that I was able to embrace it personally a lot more. So I count that as a growth opportunity for myself. I still think tink, tink, the fucking drum, but now I look at the next project we did, which has really the exact same aesthetic to it, and I think, okay, well, yeah, I really can buy into this. So I feel like that process was a growth process as an associate because I leapt forward and I was able to assimilate the aesthetic of one more designer, and that's got to be a good tool in my pocket as a designer myself. And then from being a designer myself, what do I look for in an associate is Alex assisted me on a show, and he was perfect because it's I look for somebody who does all the shit that I don't want to do. And, he does it. So, He's always perfect. That's what I think. So. See you guys later.
I have to say, as a designer, one of the things I'm always most grateful for is when the associate leans over to me and goes, "Do you think we should?" I mean, like, I will never say no to that, even if I don't agree with it or maybe even don't do it. I'm glad when somebody says it because that means they're seeing something that I'm not. So, Alex and Scott, you guys have worked on numerous shows together, and you have sort of a long-term relationship in terms of working. And I've observed when teams of people work together for periods of time, they develop something it's slightly beyond a working relationship. It's like a brother-sister relationship, or it's like it's a it's a husband and wife relationship. Can you guys talk a little bit about what, beyond just, the specific tasks of this is the designer's job, this is the associate's job, but talk, if you can give us any information or insight into how you all are able to know what one another needs before you actually ask for it or before it's needed, in ways that you can work with each other and that it feels a little bit more personal than just this is our job.
First of all, just before I even answer, I want to say two things. He does all the work, and I take all the credit. So that's basically the thing. But what Chris brought up about that chameleon thing of working with different designers. I think even for designers, that's the case. So like the Van Hove stuff, where there's an aesthetic to that. We know who he was talking about. Yeah, well, there's an aesthetic to that. That might be his aesthetic, and maybe it became a design aesthetic because he wanted that. And as designers, you guys had to accommodate that aesthetic and make it part of your own. So they may have gone through that process back in London or Amsterdam or something even before then, and he may have internalized the director's needs. And that's one of the things that we when we work with directors a lot, we tend to go, oh yeah, this is this director's aesthetic versus that director's aesthetic, and we know when we work with different directors, it's a different aesthetic world we enter, right? So you're finding just that particular aesthetic world is a very specific aesthetic world that you've entered. And it's amazing you have so many different kind of worlds that you've worked in, and you've absorbed so many different aesthetics. That's an amazing thing to be able to have been in that position, that you've done 50 shows like that, and there's a lot of artistic background you've got in that. It's amazing, actually. It's okay. So, what was the question?
Tell me about your working relationship beyond just what you're creating.
Well, I think First of all, I got to apologize to John Gramada because I stole Alex from John a few years ago. No, I didn't really steal him, but well, beyond just the working, it's kind of like what everybody else has already said is like there's an understanding about how to approach the process, and and there's a trust that we have where I just know he's going to do things basically the way I'm thinking about them, and when I come in the morning, an hour after he's come in to do all the notes from the night or start all the notes from the night before, generally it's like, oh wow, we've been on the same page. He's done all these things that if I was doing that work, I would have done, and it's a very close relationship that way. Part of it is in the beginning of the process. Chris was talking about that 75%. There's a 75% that you never really want to get too involved in as a designer, which is the comm systems and the video systems and all the stuff that's involved in just the technical side of putting a system together for Broadway and touring productions. And then there's the other 25% where I may kind of throw crazy ideas at Alex that he'll go, oh God, he's getting us in trouble again. But okay, we'll try it. And we, and that's kind of a fun thing for me and a scary thing for him because he's ultimately responsible in a certain sense for making sure that shit don't fail. I'm responsible in the end. In the end, it's my ass. If it fails, I'll never get hired by those general managers and producers again. I kind of know that when I make choices about things. But he kind of takes all the responsibility internally and goes home but doesn't sleep at night because he's so worried about it. And I know I do this to him. And I take a lot of pleasure in it. Actually, no, I don't actually, but I can't be responsible for his personal psychology. Anyway, I haven't really gone too far answering that question, but I really do think, there's a difference between, we're talking about associates now, and I think when you first work, you'll have an intern who works with you, and you get a feel for, they're helping you out on a project, and then you might hire them as an assistant, or on a recommendation, hire somebody else as an assistant. And as an assistant, I think the person really is somebody who they're really not, they don't feel comfortable, and you don't really necessarily want them to go, hey, I really think you should do it this way. It's more of like, you're here to support me, but I have the responsibility. The other designers and the director and the producer are all going to look at me. At a certain point, you get into a relationship, whether it's with Alex or Will Pickens or Drew Levy, or there's a whole list of people who have been my associates, where the responsibility that they get is that basically, if I'm not in the room, they're me basically. If they have to make a decision, I'm not going to second guess their decisions. I might come in and say, oh, maybe let's do this a little differently, and let's try this a little differently, but I'm not going to second guess them in the sense of, like, they made a choice, and I've given them responsibility to make that choice, and they've been empowered to make those choices. So that's, like, again, what Chris was saying about when you get to this point where you say, let's try this, is against, maybe you think, what about, there's a point where you become partners, and then it becomes, okay, are they your associate anymore, or your co-designer, And that's a whole nother discussion. I try to do that, but it's a more difficult thing. Like, Will and I have been doing a set of plays with Richard Nelson for the last 6 years now, where we've been co-designing, and it's really about us sharing the role of designer. And either one of us can be in the room, and either one of us can make those aesthetic decisions. And the director playwright is good with that. Whichever one of us is in the room is going to be the person who's assisting him in the work and making those aesthetic decisions. So that's a start of this, but I'll give it over to Alex now.
I mean, I think I pretty much agree with what everybody said. From my perspective, I mean, again, having done with 22 productions with John and 6, 7, I don't know, with Scott, one of the more nuts and bolts things, and one of the whole like mind reader things is, and you don't get this right away, is knowing the curveballs that your designers are going to throw at you, and also knowing how to solve those problems in a way that will work. And like Scott and I had a moment on Shuffle Along where we were trying to do this whole wackadoo thing with getting our crazy delay matrix vocal bus thing into our orchestra mains with a different EQ from the whole rest of the system. And we were like, there's got to be a way. And over the course of like the last half hour of tech and the walk to the subway station, we came up with a way. And I just looked at him and I said, no one will ever be able to troubleshoot that. We cannot do that. And so, but it was the same sort of thing. We both knew, we were both thinking the same sort of signal paths, thinking the same sort of structure. And so that's the more technical side of it. But I mean, from the aesthetic side, I think, as Chris was saying, the whole chameleon thing, you don't necessarily have to have the same aesthetic. Like, I think Scott is a much more tasteful designer than I am. But I know how to emulate his stuff when he's not in the room. I'm not gonna go and like make it big and brash. And there have been times where I've looked at him and I've said, hey, what if we try this? And he's like, no. I remember there was specifically one moment on King and I where the king enters. I was like, what if it just gets huge and swimming in reverb? And I think he did this as a plan. He goes, yeah, why don't you go talk to Mark Salzberg about that? And I go over and I say, Mark, what about this? And Mark just looks at me and goes, no, that's a terrible idea. And I think Scott basically knew Mark was going to tell me that, but just wanted to let me see what would happen. Yeah. So, but also it's For me, that I do get excited, being in that state where I can make decisions and collaborate. But like for me as well, I do totally get my nerd rocks off like problem solving. Like when Scott's like, I want to do this, this, and this, and then I sit in my bedroom at home, like at my desk, just going like, how the hell do I do it? Like also on Shuffle Along, we started running out of holes, like input and output holes. And Scott goes, how are we running out of input and output holes? I said, we got all these things. And then we basically had to find a way to get 10 more inputs for our tap mics into the system. And I sat there because I knew if I told him I couldn't do it, that wasn't going to be a good enough answer. And so then I sat there and I came up with a system that ended up working, and we were able to cut 2 input cards and replace them with output cards. But it was like I knew that he was going to tell me that, like, we got to figure this out. And so it's to me, I actually really love that stuff because that's where I can kind of like, it's like a puzzle. It's just fitting the puzzle together. So that's, and I sort of know how he wants the puzzle solved.
There's also just to finish off, there's also the other side of it, which we're talking technical, but a lot of times now on Broadway shows, the assistant or associate becomes the programmer on the show. There's all kinds of reasons, union-wise, why this has to happen. Part of it is we're not allowed to do our own programming as designers on Broadway anymore. Sometimes, depending on who's the head electrician, they'll let you do it, but you have to go in assuming you're not going to be allowed, and your associate goes over from having a USA contract to a pink contract. So you have to get an IA card. It can be an international card or whatever, and he goes over to being a programmer. And so depending on the show, depending on how much sound effect work and creative design work there is, the associate becomes the programmer who you're doing that programming work with. And I'll describe something and say, what if we do this, this, and this? And then, my associate, because they're on the pink contract, well then I'll be feeding all the effects into the QLab system and labeling all the effects and saying, this is what I want to kind of happen. What if we do this in kind of this way? And then Alex is over there doing all the QLab programming because that's the way it has to work on Broadway. It's really annoying to a lot of us who used to love doing our own programming. And it's a change, but again, it's part of like the understanding of like Chris has probably gone through this a lot now, where you have to kind of understand what that particular designer wants in terms of the programming, like how to get those drum beats to work. There's a lot of choices involved aesthetically. It's very much like being a moving light programmer in that sense. Like you have to kind of understand the aesthetic of the designer and do the programming so that that vision gets put on stage.
In a strange way, the union considerations, specifically with Broadway, have pushed us in this direction, and it's been a difficult transition, but I think ultimately a very liberating one, because the role of specifically a programmer has become much more analogous to that of a moving light programmer, who is really an essential aesthetic piece of the lighting designer's palette. If you watch a lighting designer work with a really good moving light programmer, they really talk to them very little. They just sort of say, and they move their hands a little bit, and they go, yeah, I'll take care of that. I'll show you some things, and then you pick. And that, yes, Rob?
I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh, yeah.
With this in mind, do you feel like, because the associate is suddenly taking on another job, do you feel like the associate's job is tough, and so you can take on another position, or are we cheating the production from not having an associate be an associate any longer?
I think it's interesting because I think it is all part of the evolution that I think in larger productions it will continue. It was not too many years ago when I first started 20 years ago. I worked for Abe, and I asked Abe one day if at what point would he consider titling me the associate and not the assistant? And he said, you don't want to be the associate. The associate makes less money. So we ended that there. But when I started, there really weren't too many people. There certainly weren't any associates working on plays. And there were some assistants that are Uber assistants working on musicals for a number of people, but they were all very much in the line of typical succession. And over the past 20 years, this idea of an associate, I think, has become much more prevalent, primarily due to the technology. It used to be John would come and he'd have his sound effects and he'd sort of be a one-man band, and then he'd come to New York, and as the A1, as the production sound man, you would actually do all the associate jobs plus run the show. And John would he would do his thing, and he wouldn't have to worry about where the cable went or what plugged into what, or, it was sort of my job to know that Amcron meant crown, really, and that was my only starting piece of knowledge. And over the course of time, as the technology has developed, associates became absolutely essential. And now I think we're breaking through a watershed moment where, yes, I think having an associate and a programmer is becoming more essential, because if we're sitting at the QLab desk programming away, then you can't be running up to the balcony and listening at the same time, getting the foot mics right on the play. And Rob, I'll sort of say, oh no, today's going to be a foot mic day, so we're gonna. I'll be up there. So yes, we need more people, but I think the need for more people has been growing steadily for years, and somewhat organically, as you do really need more people, you get them. The notion, the very British notion of having a production sound engineer separate from the operator was entirely unknown here in the States. And over the last 10, maybe 15 years, it's started to become a thing. And it's not a thing all the time. You don't get PSEs on plays, but on musicals, it's certainly necessary. It's necessary. So it may, next year it may be that that you're doing a show that you're like, well, Alex simply can't be programming QLab because I need another body. I see this all the time with projection designers, right? They have like 6 animators sitting next to them, right? Where did the money for that come from? They spoke loud enough and they said, look, if you want fun content, if you don't want me to just pick a picture out of a book and put it up and let it float around, then if you want custom content, I'm going to have this team of guys here making this content. And they, in a way, they were very sexy and flashy, so they sort of jumped ahead of us a little bit in the ability to get money out of these productions. But I think we have, for years, been exerting a more steady requirement for resources that slowly is being met.
I think part of this also comes down to, you were talking about this in the composers discussion earlier, about relationships you develop, not just with directors, but with producers and producing organizations. Like, there's certain general management offices where there's enough trust between them and us where I can go to them and say, on this show, I actually need a production person, not just an associate. And they'll go, why do you need? I say, because it's a really complicated show to mix, and the mixer can't leave the console, and the associate's going to be really involved in programming and system issues, and if anything systemic happens while we're in tech, while we're in rehearsal, while we're in previews, there'll be nobody in the building who can deal with those problems. We have to hire a production person. And then if you make that case to them, now they'll say, okay, we'll get a production person. And it's interesting because a lot of the engineers who I've worked with in the past liked to be their own production person. And the shows have gotten so complicated in the last few years that they've all started to realize, I can't be the A1 and mix the show and be the production person at the same time. The actual being at the desk is so complicated and so necessary all the time. I can't leave the desk. And if there's a comm problem or a video problem or something goes down in the system and we're sitting in tech because there's a problem, that person can't deal with it anymore. So it really is becoming something where like that British idea of having the production person, which is an amazing thing. I mean, you guys had a much more rational structure of doing things where the mixer would go into rehearsal and learn the show before they ever got into tech, and you'd have your A1 back in the house mixing the show, knowing the show pretty much totally by the first day of tech. It's unheard of in New York theater. And it makes so much more sense. So whether we also then need an assistant as well, I think we're getting to that point. I think there's certain really big shows now where your associate is doing that moving like programmer kind of work. The production person is dealing with all of the technical issues. And then there's a thing which really puts a burden on the associate is the assistant-oriented paperwork, where who keeps on top of the paperwork? Because like when Alice had to find those 10 more slots to do this other lame idea I had, that if the paperwork wasn't up to date, if he didn't know what was being used in what slot and where in the building and how he could patch around things, we just couldn't do it. So you have to keep your paperwork up to date, or you can't solve problems. So in that case, Alex was really stretched a lot of time during Shuffle Along, for instance, where he was doing a lot of jobs all at once, and we probably could have really used another person in the building. And I'll hand it to him now.
But you had a production man on Shuffle Along.
Yes, we did. But I'm talking about paperwork-oriented stuff. Yeah, we had Walter, who was, Walter Schwarbach, who's out in Chicago now designing SpongeBob SquarePants. So he's gone from assistant to associate to now he's designing his own big shows. And anyway, go ahead.
You just handed the mic to me. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Yeah, I think that I do. My personal stance on it is when I walk into a theater and I see the size of a lighting team, and not to say that they don't deserve that, but I look at the amount of work that we're doing and I look at the amount of work that they're doing, and I think there should be more parity. And I'm more than happy to program QLab because again, that's like I just nerd out on that and I love doing it. But there is a point where the paperwork does fall behind, and like right now, for example, the paperwork on Shuffle Along hit a certain point towards the end of things where things were getting rather insane in the theater just trying to finish the show, and I know there's some holes in my paperwork. I know that, and I know that I need to go in and do some days of documentation. I also know that I was able to go to Walter, who was our production guy, and say, he'd be like, hey, we got this thing that we got to solve. And I'd say, well, we've got these 5 spare lines on this mold that goes to here, and then we can cross pass it with blah, 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 blah. Do you want labels? And he goes, no, I'll just P-touch it. And so then at some point, I got to figure out how to document that. So there's like a certain amount of things that when you are, as an associate, wearing a lot of hats, that eventually certain things will fall behind. And I think that having another person there to be able to keep track and having somebody who can just be active and stay, for example, watching the stage, especially with the delay matrix tracking that we do, it's very important that we know where actors are at any particular point on stage. And if that were all I was doing, that'd be great. I could stay right on top of that. But when I'm bouncing around helping to troubleshoot intercom systems that no one's used before and on the phone with Timax asking them why I can't write a Q0 and all sorts of things, like that gets lost. So I think my personal stance is that I would like to see the sound departments get bigger. I think we're doing a lot, and just because people can't see it, they don't understand how much we're doing, especially since when we're doing our jobs right, no one knows we're there. So.
Just before, he brought up a point about the associate designer relationship. Like he was talking about stage tracking, which is something I do a lot of, moving the actors around to different delay zones on stage. And a lot of times I have an apprentice intern who's helping out getting all that basic stuff working. But at a certain point, the director is making changes in the blocking of the show. And both Alex and I know that we're going to have to, on a day-by-day basis, either take notes on it, or while we're watching tech, or while we're watching a performance, stand to the right of our mixer and look at the radio mic channels and go, oh, look, that person's now mid-stage right. And we go to their bus, and we change the bus, and we store it. And who's ever at the console is going to do that work. It's not something that only I can do. And same thing with like EQing things or changing levels where they need it. You know, we both do those jobs depending on who's where. You know, like, or that thing about running up to the balcony to listen to the system. Well, we did shuffle along mixing from the balcony, so it was running downstairs to the orchestra. Whichever one of us is down there will take mental notes and make changes. Alex is very good about going, you know, I heard something downstairs. Is it okay if I do this? Because he knows I'm a little proprietary about balances and things like that. So he's actually fairly careful about that stuff, but he'll listen to it and bring the information back upstairs. So
It was on Fiddler where I started feeling confident touching vocal EQs for you. I up until then I was like, oh, but on Fiddler I finally started getting a feel for how you like to do that. So on Shuffle Along, you know, you started giving me notes during the show, like, oh, go do this, and blah, 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 blah.
yeah, because, you know, people like, well, this is one of these things, going back to the Tony Award thing, people think like, well, what is a particular designer's style in a musical? Like, you're just doing sound reinforcement, but like, just the sense of how you EQ a radio mic. Every one of us who does sound design on Broadway for musicals, anybody who does sound design for musicals, has a different sense of the tonal spectrum. And if you look at people's EQs, they're all going to look different. And that's an aesthetic. That's not, you know, we're not doing, some people like it crispier, some people like more bottom, some people like more punch, but it's an aesthetic. It's like mixing a record, you know? So again, like what Chris was saying and what Alex is responding to is, I have a particular way of hearing that they've internalized as associates, and they can actually kind of put that in their head and dial that in. They're not using their own personal aesthetic, they're using the designer's aesthetic, but they've internalized it. So John was going to ask a question.
Oh yeah, I just was going to ask, so far we're talking mostly about, you know, associate design in New York, and that seems to be like a viable career path for people even to make a living as an associate, but outside of, on Broadway, yeah. But yeah, so I wondered, both for, you know, you, Lindsay, you work all over the place, and Alex, you've worked in regional theater situations. You know, how is being an associate or an assistant different in regional theaters and in non-commercial situations? And should we be asking for more associate help in regional theaters? Do we need? How do we expand the use of associates, and how do they function differently?
You know, my experience in regional theater is that they're very loath to bring in associates from out of town. They'll do it if you have to, but they won't. That you have to really force them to do it. That's been my experience. They'll give you somebody local, that's somebody at the local university who's interested in sound design, who'd be willing to come over a few days and help you out. But it is harder to get skilled associates in from out of town. I mean, there's a theater I work in Chicago where and I've worked there for many years, they've told me point blank they will never bring in an out-of-town assistant. And I say, you know, if you pay them the same, what's the difference? And they're like, basically, we don't want to pay for their housing. That's really what it comes down to, is they don't want to pay for their housing. So I say, okay, I'll find their housing, which I usually do. I have a friend who can put them up in Chicago, and they stay there. And then they are able to do the show. And I'm willing to make that sacrifice because that person's skill set is really important to me. But it shouldn't have to be like that. And you know, it's the same. Doing a musical on Broadway is the same as doing a musical in Oregon. You know, there's a lot of the same things that have to go into it. So it's not like it's any less hard because you're in a different state. So I think that's worth looking into. I wanted to open this up a little bit to everybody in the room. One of the things I've observed in certain designer-associate relationships, and I think sometimes this happens with particularly with designers from other countries, is the associate has a sort of split allegiance between the designer, if they are a programmer and they're on a pink contract, the IA, and occasionally the GM, the people who are responsible for the ultimate cost of the show. And so I've heard of certain incidences where an associate will say, I don't think we should make this choice because I think it's going to reflect badly on my relationship with the GM if I have to go to them and ask for this money, or if I have to get additional resources. And I'm just curious, what, as an associate, and I know there are a number of people in this audience who are associates, how do you determine where your loyalty and your allegiance goes? Is it to the GM? Is it to the designer? Is it to, if you're a programmer on a pink contract, you have to satisfy a lot of different masters in order to do the job. And I'm just wondering if people would be willing to talk about the balance between those things and how it is interesting. Anybody want to take a shot at it? Okay, great. Beth.
I haven't personally run into that particular situation in that I always find that my loyalties are to the designer because I very much view being an associate and an assistant as a mentorship relationship because I would like to be a designer and I don't necessarily want to have the systems path of being an associate designer on Broadway. So I always find that if it's something that I do need to go to the GM and say, we need X, Y, and Z for this amount of money, I always will say to the designer, I will make this case, but you're going to have to go to this person and make this case again and again and again, because I will say it and it will not be heard. So at least for me, I always go to the designer and say, you have to make this case 3 times more than I can. So.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing with associates for sure, is the whole idea that certain directors treat them as if they have 3/4 of the identity rather than the full identity of a real person in the room, and they will look at you and listen to you. They will acknowledge that you have said it, but they will not. Yes, but then they will not. They're not going to actually take it into account. Yes, Sam.
I agree. Certainly, my loyalty is pretty firmly to the designer because of all the people you've listed, the designer's the one with the fewest advocates. And so if I can be one, then great. The GM doesn't need anyone on their side because they're the one with the purse strings. So I think to me, the way I feel like I can provide the best value to the show as a whole is to establish myself with the GM or the producer or the artistic director, depending on the environment, and say listen, I'm a reasonable person and I'm not going to come to you for something that I need unless I need it. And the reason that I'm going to need it is so that your show is good. And once you believe that that's what I am and what I'm about, then I can, I worked a year ago on a big show at a tiny theater. And the sound budget was, I would say, 1/3 the size that it ought to have been, and almost 10 times the size of their typical sound budget. So the theater, in their mind, was doing the biggest show in their history, and in my mind was doing the smallest version of this show that could be done. And I got the artistic director and the production manager into the idea that I'm going to come to you with practical things so that the designer so that Bray can stay with the director and talk about art, and they don't have to get mired in this. And then, but once I do that, I'm going to need things from you. I'm going to get things from you as best as I can. And they got to believe that, and that was how that stayed productive. But I think for me, anyway, there's no notion about a split allegiance. My allegiance is to the show, and my route to the show is with the designer.
Yeah. Does anybody working as an associate here, do you ever feel like, I don't want to say you're running interference, but you're attempting to be an ambassador for the designer to the audio crew and to the people in the house that are working on the show? And what can you speak to what that's like in terms of how you're trying to communicate big picture ideas to people who are really doing the nuts and bolts work of it? Can you address that?
Yeah, and also to go back to the other thing where I have been on a Pink contract for a show, and I've been on a USA 29 contract for a show. The union contract is just there so that I play by union rules. I'm still completing the sound designer's vision. That being said, if the designer asks me to do something while I'm on the union contract that is theoretically not accepted by IATSE, I will then tell the designer that, and we'll find a workaround. So once again, my loyalty is always to the designer. It's just depending on whose rule book I'm playing under at the time. As an associate or an assistant, I find that lots of times when my designers ask me to do crazy things that they're trying for the first time, I'm also the person who has to try to explain to the crew why we're trying an idea that they've never tried before. I'm trying to come up with solutions that are easy for the crew to troubleshoot so that when the crazy idea doesn't go to plan right away, they don't just give up and are frustrated, that they know how to approach a problem in the same mindset as the designer who wants to try a new problem. So.
Some of it, I think, is it's a designer's prerogative.
Sorry. This is all being recorded for posterity.
Yes. Some of it, I think, is it's a designer's prerogative to say, I want to do this thing. This is part of my design. And then it's the associate's prerogative to figure out how to make that happen. And so whether it's being an ambassador or being a translator or whatever it is, I think part of the job is, Scott doesn't want to have to worry about the nuts and bolts. Or when John's composing, he doesn't want to have to worry about how the exact signal path to get that sound to come out up there. They just want to say, I want to do this. And then if you want to call it translation and whatever you want to call it, it's the associate's job then to go and say, okay, well, I need these people to do this to achieve that. We need to blah, 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 blah. So I think you're kind of a tool for your designer in that way, for them to just be as purely creative as they can be. Because that's, I think when we're all sound designing, even those of us who work as associates, when we're sound designing, we want to stay as creative as possible and not get mired down in the nuts and bolts, and that's why the associate's there, is to get mired down in the nuts and bolts.
I feel like we didn't really. I don't think we fully addressed John's thing, and I think this has been very much about kind of Broadway associate stuff in a way, and the regional off-Broadway thing is really important because there's a lot of work that gets done in those places, and like off-Broadway right now, I just know another designer who just got offered a show, and it's a big show in a little theater, and he looked at it and said, this is 8 weeks of my time, and I need an assistant on this. And they said, well, you have $1,000 for an assistant. And he's like, well, how can I commit to an 8-week project and find any assistant who's a real assistant? It's not like an intern. I need somebody. How do I deal with this? How do I get it across to these producers that this organization that this is a necessary person? And this is not just sound design. I think this is a general off-Broadway issue, and there's a very different set of issues with regional theater, vis-a-vis associates and assistants. But I mean, I think that's something that a lot of designers and composers have to deal with a lot more in the environment of American theater. That I think we should talk about that a little more. I think.
Yeah, it's really challenging. There's a lot going on right now off Broadway. I'm sure most of you are aware of it. At this point, there is a real push to, increase the amount of money that can be allotted to an associate on an off-Broadway show. It's a big deal. We're asking people to do a tremendous amount of work and not really get paid a fair rate for it. And then what inevitably happens is the designer has to go into their own pocket to subsidize it, and they become these uncredited producers on the show. And it's a drag, because I don't receive anything as an uncredited producer other than I get to do the job that I was being paid to do for less money than I was actually hired to do it with. And I know that the most recent action that's happening currently, in which designers are attempting to negotiate with different off-Broadway theaters. There are different collectives of off-Broadway theaters here in New York. That is 100% motivated by designers saying, this is a line in the sand. We have reached a place by which we must demand better conditions in order for this to happen. This is not sustainable, and we can't ask people to make their living like this. This is New York City. They gotta eat, and so it is really. I'm really curious to hear. I know a lot of you have experience in off-Broadway associate work. What do you ever feel as associates this real sort of struggle, I guess, between wanting to be loyal and helpful to the designer and yet having to draw a personal line for yourself by which you were, after which you'll be taken advantage of? Every single show. Okay.
So,
They said it every show.
every show. I am very often hired by the general manager, and I don't think I have ever felt particularly divided in my loyalty between designer and general manager. But that said, I think it's very, and again, I come from a very Broadway perspective. I think it's worth bearing in mind that it is very easy to demonize the general managers, but they are, in truth, they are just as invested in the success of your sound design as a designer, which is why they went out and say maybe hired me to go help somebody from out of town who may not be familiar with the intricacies of the New York work. But what the business in general is facing is a diminishing pool of both funds and time to deal with the amount of work that's to be done on a show that, ironically, I think directors are demanding. Producers are going to see other product and they're saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? And you go, well, yeah, we can do that. It's going to cost you a little more money. And sometimes they might go, okay, well, how much more? And then if you tell them how much more, maybe you knock them right off their feet and they have to sit down and they go, well, I wasn't thinking it would be that expensive. But it's almost subconsciously, we're coming into these relationships and directors are expecting a certain level of sound design service, and we are all striving to reach that, and that's right down from the sound designer to the associate. As an associate for a Broadway show, I would never in a million years count my days on a USA contract and then say, oh, no, I'm sorry, my contract's up. Good luck to you. I'm out. I'll go to the general manager and say, look, we're just not in a place where I can get out of here. You have any more money to pay me? And if sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But the loyalty is not only to the sound designer, but to the project. And if we all dip into our pockets, we're all sort of, it's because we all feel so strongly about the product, and we're all sort of collectively responsible for maybe not getting every cent of resources that we ought to get, because it is incumbent upon us to speak up. It's also incumbent upon us to participate in the conversation and try to slowly push forward. And I have ultimately a very sunny disposition about how this process works, because looking at the last 20 years, we do have way more resources today than we did 20 years ago. The shops are getting screwed with their pants on because the amount of gear that we ask for is 3, 6, 8 times as much as we used to get, and they pay the same amount. But that's okay, because they're in it too, right? So everybody, it's an ecosystem, and everybody swirls around, and adds to the quality of work that's happening, which is skyrocketing, by the way. I mean, the quality of what all of us are doing on a show-by-show basis is exponentially higher than what we could accomplish some years ago. It is getting better, but especially in the regional theaters where they don't understand and they don't quite get it, I think then you have to just keep making your case. One person at a time. And it's not just with management at the theaters, it's with the directors. Because if the directors aren't behind you, they're the ones asking you for this kind of work. And if they're not behind you to go and say, yeah, look, but this is really important to me, you're never going to get listened to. So since I said we're all responsible for digging into our own pockets a little bit, we similarly have to keep speaking up in a positive way, because the one thing that turns off the producing teams and the general managers is anonymity. So
I think that's a really good point. And here, will you pass this to Ken? I think anyone that I've talked to who's an associate off-Broadway and in regional theater, they are doing it because they are sincerely dedicated to doing the best possible job they can do. I know that everyone has a true dedication and passion for helping that designer achieve the greatest work possible. And that is incredibly valuable to me as a designer. It's also, it is, as Scott said earlier, the job could not get done if there wasn't an associate there as dedicated as they were. That being said, I know that associates frequently look at working in a crew position, and that could potentially pay them more money than it would to work in an associate designer position. And at a certain point, one has to ask, and Anna Lee actually would be a terrific person to ask, except I just gave away the microphone, which is, at what point are you looking at making a decision financially about, can I continue to support this life choice of being an associate, of trying to generate these incredible designs, and possibly put myself at personal risk by not being able to support myself?
Yeah. So right now I'm primarily working as an A2, though I was much more design oriented when I got out of school and started my career off Broadway. And honestly, crew positions are so much more lucrative. I don't think anybody thinks that that's any different. And it's something that, it's a decision that I've had to make about my identity as somebody in the sound community. I've always thought of myself as a designer. But I love A2ing. It's a thing that I find very fulfilling. And at some point, I'm going to have to decide whether this is all that I do, or if I'm going to be able to make time for taking a financial hit to do a project that I really believe in. So it's constantly a balance. And I've only been doing the show I'm doing right now for the last 2 years, but that's the longest time that I've ever run a show. So, I hope that a project will come along that I'll be, really believe in and take some time off and just say that I'm going to take the financial hit to do this artistic opportunity, but that's
Do you look for opportunities? I mean, are you actively looking for other things to do?
Right now, no. It's too busy.
Because you're busy doing the work and,
Yeah.
and being paid pretty decently.
And a couple of times, some friends of mine that we used to make experimental work, in basements together, have been hey, we should do, a divisive thing.
Yeah.
And we're kind of, we'll pitch ideas back and forth, but honestly, I just don't have the time if I'm gonna keep this job. So, yeah, you have to make a choice, and sometimes it means putting things on hold if you decide that making some money is a priority right now, or paying off my student loans is big priority right now. So that's a thing.
Great. I wanted to give this back to Ken, who graciously gave it away. And I know, Ken, you have experience with both working in crew positions as well as associate designer positions.
I would say a third of my time is spent as an an associate assistant, a third being in crew positions, and another third doing random designs. I will say that while it's nice to be asked to dig in our own pockets to put into a show that we believe in, eventually I will not make rent, and I will not be able to afford to live in this city, and I will not be able, therefore, to afford to do theater anymore. And I know also that the more I take more crew positions, the more I lose those contacts of people who want to do the cool basement shows, who want to do a show that's going to go to Edinburgh Fringe Festival, for instance. So the reason why I'm so invested in like this 829 off-Broadway thing is because I know that it's just trying to make me at least get parity of pay between an off-Broadway crew position and an off-Broadway assistant position. $800 a week is not a lot of money in this city, and I think we've all been asked to do shows where if we did the math, it's $150 a week, if that at all. And so that's when we start, that's when we can't go, when our designers say, hey, let's go out for, cool sushi someplace. We say, cool, I'm bringing my peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my pocket, I think we've all started there and we've all been there, but eventually there is a limit, and it's we all believe in the designer, we all want to get mentored by the designers, but at some point we're going to go mix on a Behringer console or a Mackie somewhere just so that we can eat for a month. So
I just wanted to say something a little more about that. I think the idea that the crew person is getting paid that weekly salary and then the associate on an off-Broadway or regional thing is paid a fee is a real problem. I mean, I think, and one of the good things about the Broadway contracts is it's very clear with 829, an assistant is on a weekly, as well, on the sound contract, it's a daily, but we say it's a 6-day week, so it ends up becoming equivalent to the other designer weeklies. One of the good things about it being a weekly contract is that we can go to a producer and say, there's 2 weeks of paperwork, 3 weeks in the shop, 2 weeks of load-in, 2 weeks of tech, 3 weeks of previews. It's a 14-week job. And it's 14 weeks at the USA minimum, or because I have an associate who I think should get more, minimum plus whatever you can get, I think it's really useful to not have the associate work on a fee basis. That I think we have to start defining the associate's job more like the crew job, not, and not make it into like a judgment thing. It's just easier to go to the nonprofit theaters, the regional theaters, because face it, there's very little kind of for-profit off-Broadway anymore. Almost all of it is nonprofit theaters, and they're looking at fees all the time. They just want to give you a fee, and they want to give your assistant or associate a fee. You can't ask a person to work for you on those fees. They have to understand that it's a daily, weekly wage that they have to get paid. And we make, even on the Broadway stuff, the commercial stuff, we make the point to a lot of our assistants and associates, you sure you want to be a designer? Because you make a lot more money as an assistant because you actually are getting paid weekly for those 16 weeks and we're just getting a fee. Of course, if the show does well, we get our royalties. But I think, and this is like another one of these discussions that this organization is going to be great for. Like, how does designers and associates and assistants and operators approach the industry and make our case financially to make it a case where we can make a living wage for everybody on our team? And it's going to be a different strategy for each member and in different financial environments. And the nonprofits are going to be different than Broadway. But I think as we talk about this, we'll come up with more general national strategies about how to deal with these things,
I think that as a off-Broadway assistant and associate, our biggest advocate is the designer, in that I have gone from theater to theater to theater and heard oh, you got paid $1,300 for this show, I got offered $800, and it's the same amount of time, it's the same, just a straight play with dress playback, no live elements or anything like that. And there's very little transparency amongst assistants and associates of how much we're getting offered. And it's unacceptable. We need to be able to talk to each other about that and say, if I'm getting offered this much, you should be getting offered that much. And I think that the designers are the ones who can really say, no, on my last show here, I got this much, my assistant got this much, this person also deserves this. And it's kind of rare to actually have designers be able to successfully go to bat for us in that manner. And I can tell you they all try, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging as a designer who does go to bat for their assistants.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough because you have to go to the management who you are already asking other things of and trying to get favors and help, and then say, hey, listen, you know, you're kind of not paying my associate enough. How about that? It's a vulnerable position, and it's at the beginning of the process when you haven't really proven your worth to the production in certain cases. So it's like everybody thinks sound design is really important by the time you get to the second week of previews. Like there's no doubt about that. Everybody knows really how important it is then. But, you know, the first week of rehearsal, they're like, it's still very abstract to them. Like, yeah, we'll make sure you get your speakers. But, it is really tough. You know, it's funny, I was thinking about Will Pickens, who Scott mentioned earlier, who Will and I have worked together for, I think, 15 years now. And my first show on Broadway, we wanted to hire this engineer who would mix the show. And he said, listen, I really want to do the show. I'd love to be on it. The only thing is my wife is expecting to have a baby. And it's going to happen at some point during previews. So I went to general management. They were not thrilled about this idea. So I said to Will, I was like, hey, listen, would you be willing to just mix for the day or so that the engineer's not here, since you'll know the show by that point? Would you be willing to do it? And he was like, okay, all right, I'll do it. Because he was already on a pink contract as a programmer. So he took on the job. And so for the couple of days that our engineer was gone, Will worked harder than anybody I've ever seen in my whole life. He was like production audio, he was programming, he's, the associate, he's doing all these things. And I every time I would see him, I would be like, I'm really sorry you're having to do all this work. I'm really sorry. And he was like, it's okay, it's all right, it's okay. And because Will, of course, is one of the nicest people in the world. And so then about a week later, we were talking about it over dinner one night, and I said, I'm really sorry you had to do all that work. And he's like, actually, it worked out great. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, I got paid more to be a production audio and the associate and the programmer. Like, I made a tremendous amount of money doing that. I wish that happened more often. So I was like, okay, well, I guess that's not so bad then. I don't know why I told this story, but anyway, that's an example of it.
So I have one quick question for the designers out there who work primarily in Off-Broadway and in the regional theaters. At what point, and this is maybe an uninformed question, at what point, because knowing that there's always finite resources, and especially if you work commercially, someone is losing that money. Let's face it, something like Mr. Van Bergen, what's the 90% of investment is lost? 95? 95. All right, someone's losing that money. So there's always a finite amount of funds, especially when you're dealing with nonprofits who are just working hard at raising money and shoveling it into the maw of production. But at what point, and if you all start throwing empty bottles at me, that's fine. At what point, as designers, do you throttle back the promises you make to a director and say, I'm sorry, I can't do that because I just simply don't have the resources on this production to do that for you? So when they say, hey, I have a great idea for a cue, or I'd really love to do this, you say, I would love to do that. That sounds awesome. And it is within my ability, however, I just can't. I would love to, but it's not going to be a practical thing. Has anyone, as a designer, actually done that? I do that. And has it worked out? Because that, to me, it strikes me that's the kind of thing that will help put pressure on the organizations.
It works out
themselves.
terribly.
It works out terribly.
It works out terribly because you necessarily have to conflate a business decision with a personal relationship.
But as designers, you are both business people and artistic people. And
No, I
if-
mean,
if
I
you're
have to
doing that for
conflate
your-
someone else's business decision with my personal relationship. That's the problem.
Well, and that's what, at what point are you willing to risk a collaborative relationship with the director by letting the director know? As a designer, you're the person who artistically can sort of put a price on what that that artistic urge is going to be. Like, look, okay, I think it's a great idea. We're going to put some money into it. It's going to cost this much money, this much time. And Mark really wants to say something.
Chris?
Either.
Both.
I mean, if they're not giving you the resources as designers off Broadway and regionally, if they're not going to give you those resources, at what point, as sound designers, do you have to risk your collaborative relationships in order to co-opt those people who might be listened to more by the money people? Because we know there's a fixed amount of money out there, and the money doesn't just grow on trees.
Well, we do it right away. Maybe we don't do it in the very, very, very first meeting, because that's when it's all pie in the sky. But very, very early in a process, if a director's asking for something, and a lot of this has to do with experience over the years, but if they're asking for something that we know is going to cost money, we say, we're going to have to find a way to do this.
Well, because my experience on Broadway shows, especially with you, is we never fail, really, to deliver some form of what the idea is and how to accomplish it. But if what I'm hearing from John, from Lindsay, from everybody else is off Broadway, they're going to give you an assistant for $800 a week, and you're saying, how can I ask my assistant? I mean, $800 period. I'm sorry, $800 period. Right? How am I going to ask that person to work for me and with me for 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, for a measly $800? And at what point do we, as human beings, say, well, that's not really going to happen? And then what's the next logical step past? Well, that's not really going to happen.
Are you asking about off-Broadway specifically, or are you asking about
Off-Broadway,
regionally?
regional, whatever. I mean,
I
know John
really
used to just stay
varies.
up all
It
night
varies.
cutting tape himself.
Well,
Yeah.
he's old, and we used to do that too. But I'm glad you brought up John for just a second, because we don't have a tremendous amount of time left. But as long as we got John here and he came all the way over. No, but you're right. But my question actually is for both of you guys. What's the specificity and difference of the kind of relationship that you guys have as an associate and someone who's way far away? And how does that work? And what's different about that relationship, Chris and John?
It works. I think it works really well. The question that you asked about how often do you tell a director he can't have it because they haven't got any money, that I'll do. That's not a problem at all. It's not, if he asks specifically for something and there's a cost involved, I'll say, this is the cost that's involved. And in fact, we did it on Jumpers, because the original plan when we moved Jumpers from London to Broadway was that David Laveau, who directed it, I said, do you want surround in the theatre? And he said no. A week in, he changed his mind. And I said, it's going to cost. Chris costed it, went to the management, and they, to my amazement, said yes. But it was a considered cost, but it wasn't my problem. It's something that I knew could be achieved, but it had a cost to it. And if the director wanted it enough, bear in mind that David Laveau just hit somebody, quite famously, a critic in a bar, so I suspect they were a bit frightened of him. But as you know, the people I work with as associates are people I trust. They have to be people I trust. They're people that I know. They're people who do the work the way I want it to do. And I'm very relaxed sitting here in Manhattan, knowing that there is there has been this afternoon a run-through of a play that I'm opening at the end of the week with my associates sitting in, and I don't have a problem with that at all. She's not sent me any emails either, so either it's great or I've been sacked. And she's afraid to tell me. But the whole relationship thing, it's something that, as you say, and as a 6-year-old child told me last week, I'm a very old man. And it's taken me a long time to get to have a team of people that I trust, that I go to implicitly. And it's not just associates in the theatre. It's when I'm in New York and I want recording work done, I go to John Kilgore, who I first met in 1984. If I'm in London and I need an ace band fixed, I go to a fixer who I've known for years, who will put together a team of musicians in a studio that I know about. And it's, I mean, it's, as far as I'm concerned, part of my work as a sound designer is to have relationships from the very bottom, from the grunts, if you like, who do the speaker lifting and all the rest of it, up to the director. And we are all part of one team, and we all know another, and we all know how we work together. And we're all in our various ways working to get the show on the best way we can. I have to say that the reason, I mean, I am paying my associate out of my fee to do the work for me in London. My fee for the show, I'll be quite absolutely honest, I can't remember what the current exchange rate is. This is a big show, and I've been in rehearsals a lot. The fee is £3,500, which is about, what, $5,000? Half of which she's getting. So I'm getting $2,500 to do a big production of Macbeth in the Globe Theatre on the South Bank in London. Big, big, massive, lovely. And it's kind of not a lot of money, really, is it? For an involvement for me of 6 weeks' work. And the cleaners are getting paid more than I am. So,
just to address Chris's question, I literally got a note 2 days ago from an off-Broadway production I'm currently working on, and the note was, we'd like to scatter various speakers around the theater randomly. Can we do that?
What did Will say?
And Will called me before I even read the email. And, but my answer to it is my answer to everything when I get a question like this, which is sure, yeah, we can totally do that. Anything's possible. If you are willing to make compromises in other areas because this is a priority idea for you, you bet. We can totally do it. However, I just want you to understand that there will have to be compromises in other ways in order to satisfy this idea. If you're comfortable with making that compromise, then great. We'll have it ready to go. But if you are uncomfortable with that compromise, then you need to look at the reality of what that compromise produces, which is that these things will not take place. And I do that, I try to do that because I want to give people the empowerment to make those decisions so that it's not me saying, I can't do this, it's too much money. I'm saying, I can totally do this. However, you need to decide what's important. If this isn't important enough from you, I'm your man. But otherwise, I can't help you.
Yeah, it's going back to exactly what you were saying before, where using that metaphor of a set designer, if the set designer is given a budget of $500 and they want to build Wicked, like, you're going to have a $500 Wicked set, right? And I had an experience on a show once where the designer and myself, who was his engineer, weren't told that they were going to put the band in the pit and close the pit off, and neither of us were involved in that conversation. So we went back with a bid and said, well, this is how much gear we need to rent in order to accomplish that. And they were like, what? It's like, well, you made this decision without us. We would have told you ahead of time there was a cost associated with that, and this is what that cost is.
We're all really good at putting a number to kit issues as designers. Well, okay, you want to scatter speakers all over the theater, it's going to cost this much money. But are we indeed being as good at identifying the human cost of how long it takes to accomplish some of the amazing things we can accomplish? Whereas, truthfully, when it was just John staying up all night cutting tape, he'd come in, bleary-eyed with, having drank, 10 gallons of coffee, and say, here, I have this one cue done. And they'd be like, well, I asked you for, 6 things yesterday. All right, that's tomorrow night's then. But now we just, sort of, a guy will come and some Pro Tools will happen and it's magic and then it shows up. Are we shooting ourselves in the foot by being so forthcoming with, are we enabling that?
It's a great point.
You said something about moving to a weekly fee. That there's a practical consideration that actually I have come to this conversation to put this before the group. We at the moment the current pitch to off-Broadway theaters that United Scenic Artists is trying to make is that assistants are going to move to exclusively on USA contracts, exclusively paid by the producer, $750 a week with the assumption of 3 weeks of work from the outset. And if shows need more than 3 weeks of work, then the designer and or the assistant slash associate and or director and or someone, there's a contractual provision that says you can ask for more than 3 weeks, and the producer's got to respect that as a normal question and not a special question. And this is a problem because the Department of Labor is redefining the barrier for overtime pay eligibility, and they're defining it higher than $750 a week. If you're being paid a flat fee, you're not eligible for overtime, period. So the designers are off that question. But for the assistants and associates, if we are paid less than $932 per week on a weekly rate, we're overtime eligible. I think that's no problem. If I work for $750 a week, more than 40 hours, yeah, I want overtime. But producers, we fear, are going to treat this as a non-starter and say, oh, overtime eligible, we're going to make assistants and associates overtime eligible? I don't think so. So the problem that we now need to solve before the 20th of this month is what to propose when the negotiations begin on the 20th of this month to counteract that anxiety from the producers.
I know John has a question, but just speaking to that, I was speaking to a contract lawyer last weekend, and he said, it's federal law, this is the reality of America now, and it's a good thing. The fact that this administration has put forward these new rules for overtime is unbelievable. It's a fantastic thing. It's like, wow, is this like some kind of European social democracy idea? I mean, it's fantastic, you know? It's because I was curious, like in the end, what John thinks about all these questions. I mean, all these discussions we've been having, being from England, but yeah, you have to figure out how to approach that, but it's the law, and that helps.
No, I'm saying the producers are going to say, oh, so we need to have an answer for them, and the clock is quite literally ticking.
Well, this is my question. You've answered it, actually, and that is that we really need the employers to pay the assistants directly. Because what's happening now is that the money gets paid to us, and you guys lose it in the administrative costs that it costs us to pay you. And so that's a big problem. And also, I don't want to pay anyone less than $1,100 a week. You know, and so I try to lay it out for you. This is what I want for this amount of money, and I don't see it as a fee. I say this is how much amount of your time can I buy for this money. So, and I don't see how anyone could live for anything less than that. But to know that it's being addressed in USA is great, and I hope whatever we can do to help, let us know.
So, as somebody who has shifted from a very busy sound design career in theater to both production, sound mixing, production managing, and designing for corporate events and television to make more money, because we live in New York City and my wife and I have a family. We've made significant changes in our lives. I made a significant commitment to step on the other side of the line and make a living. My wife and I have been able to make that adjustment and then looked at the other side of where shows are being produced, the choices that were being made. We have become producers on Broadway shows to be able to have a voice at the table. And it gives me a unique perspective. It's educated me a great deal. It's also allowed me to educate other people, other producers and production folk, a great deal. And you have to be involved in the conversation in the other room if you want to have a sense of how to make change happen sometimes. So with that perspective, I would say your answer to them should be make it $932 a week or make them hourly employees, and make it flat. Yeah, said if it's going to be a flat, it has to be $932 according to the federal standard, or it has to be an hourly. They have to be an hourly employee. And you think that they'll agree to 40 hours a week? Look at your tech schedule. And I mean that's the thing. We have to, as collaborators, we have to say, I'm going to serve the designer. I'm going to serve the if the GM hires me for an associate who's from out of town, or I don't know. I want to serve both of those masters. My job is to be a master tactician and politician and go, hey, tell you what, we're going to talk to the director and get the director to talk to the producer, and I'm going to go to the GM and warn them and say this is coming and go, hey, by the way, there's a brilliant idea happening right now in the theater, and it may require some money, but we're trying to figure out the best way to make it happen, and this idea is going to come forward, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that we may ask you for more money. And it probably will come from the director or a combination from the
notes session tonight, but just, think about it. Be prepared for this possibility. And then, talk to the director and say, we've got to figure out exactly what we want to do and how to make it happen so we can then go to the producer and say, we're going to need more money. So I've served the designer and the director and the GM who all have, are not being snowballed by this when we go, hey, we had this great idea happen today and we need a lot of money to make it happen. So they're not, sitting there going, well, what, By the same token, the producers are trying to figure out return on investment. They're looking at a budget which has been put together by their two experts, a GM and a tech supervisor, who've said, this is what we can do it for. And so when there's anything that's abnormal, they're going, well, how come my business plan isn't working? So we have to educate them and say, this business plan doesn't work. It doesn't follow federal minimum standards. And you can't have slave wages. And so we have to stand together and go, we're going to follow the federal guidelines. It's either going to be, $9.32 a week, or it's going to be hourly employees. And either way, you're stuck with it because, much like Obamacare, which totally screwed up my health care and my wife's health care, because I had a great deal going on, but, we have to follow it. There's no way around it. But if you put it in their lap and go, here's what we'd like to do, we have to follow what's happening. And tell them you're partnering with them. We have to follow the federal guidelines that are happening now. People have to work for this. And they'll say, oh, no, it's going to be a flat fee. It's going to be a flat fee. Well, let's stand shoulder to shoulder in the line and draw the line in the sand and go, you want to do theater? We can either do it all for nothing or all for something. So, but just like we have to try and figure. I hope that's helpful. I want it to be helpful. I want to be able to move it forward, but I also want people to be able to make a living. We all deserve to be able to have a place to put our head and put food on the table.
It is helpful. The problem is that our belief is. Our feeling right now is that the most likely response from the other side of the table when we sit down to negotiate and we ask for anything like you just described will be no, the end. And when the other side simply says no, the end, you're out of options very quickly. And it's hard to negotiate with someone who is disinclined to treat your lowball like minimum viable suggestion as that. They treat that as, this is what you want. We say, no, this is what we're willing to settle for, and they view that as no. Then it's, that's why I'm opening it up, because I want to try to come up with a better lowball offer to allow them to continue talking instead of simply.
Tell them to talk to their lawyer and say, the Department of Labor is going to have an issue with you, and that's going to be much more expensive than the couple of $100 we're talking about per show.
Yeah.
And the Department of Labor is a terrifying entity. When you talk to somebody who's producing a show, whether if it's the Public Theater or the Flea, they have to go, well, at some point we're going to answer to somebody. A lot of theaters have been, okay, this is my baby and we're going to do it in an absolute shoestring and I'll get my buddy to work it with me and you're my buddy and you're going to help me with this. We're all going to do this for nothing. We'll eat ramen and and make it happen. But at some point they're working with a real budget and they have a real budget, whether it's to have the theater where they put on their space and then pay everybody crap wages. There's money there somewhere. So at some point we have an entity that we all have to answer to. And the federal government can be your friend where you go, I've been talking to our lawyers to try and figure this out, how to make it work, because we're looking for the long term and we want to be good partners with you as an artist. We're trying to make it all work, but we're beholden to what the changes in the government. Nobody wants to pay $15.75, for minimum wages, except for the people who are flipping burgers going, wouldn't that be a great change from what it currently was? So, I would say push it back and go, we'd love to partner with you on this. This is what we're told is coming down the pike. So if we're all prepared, let's follow the Department of Labor's minimum standard with 932 or turn them into hourly employees, which, is one step away from being union employees, and that'll terrify the crap out of them. So...
Good point. We are at time, unfortunately, if you want to get the last word in.
Well, I don't want to get the last word, but $15 an hour, 70-hour work week for an associate designer, $1,050 at $15 an hour. Bingo. So federal law.
Yep.
I really, can we let John just respond to what he's been hearing? 'Cause I'm just curious, cultural from across the pond, what he's, how he responds to what we're talking about.
It's kind of the same but different. I work a lot for small theatre companies or regional theatre companies which just offer you a fixed budget. I very, very rarely have an assistant paid for. If I'm doing a musical, it's a different matter, but then I work in a different way. As you know, the balance engineer will be the guy who sits in rehearsals and learns the show. The production sound engineer will be the guy who comes in and rigs the kit and is with you usually up until you say, it's fine, you can go home. If you've got an assistant or an associate, it depends very much on what that person's job is or what you want that person's job to be. But it's not a position that if I have an assistant, I pay them. Management don't pay them. I mean, I have to fight a lot to try and get anybody to help. Sometimes I have to fight to get a production sound engineer to put the kit up. And managements will squeeze and squeeze and squeeze in the UK, especially in the West End. It's a pretty awful situation at the moment. Regional theatres, because they're subsidised, and arts subsidies have been cut to the bone, have now more development staff and people appealing for money than they do technical staff. So the show I've just done, which was, my sound operator, was the deputy electrician. And that's when in the same theatre that I started out in 1972, as the sound department. I was the sound department. And 40 years later, over 40 years later, they have no sound department. They have an electrics department. It's not a great situation to be in. What I hear you all doing in terms of fighting for the minimum wage that you want and the right pay that you want, I think is absolutely fantastic. And I'll support you all the way. It's not going to happen in the UK. It's getting worse. But we don't have a government that's particularly interested in looking after people who aren't paid very much. They're much more interested in looking after people who've got a great deal of money and seeing what they can do for them, which is a sad thing. And if we end up leaving Europe, which is now, unfortunately, looking like a distinct possibility, it's going to get much, much worse. Workers' rights in the UK will just disappear. We'll be all being paid as the lowest cost people that we probably can. Yeah, it's going to be a disaster. So I'm voting that we stay in. So there.
Well, on that note, it's a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of you for participating. I want to thank all of our panelists, and thank you all for coming. And let's keep this discussion going because it is totally worthwhile. So thank you all very much.
And thank you for not throwing bottles at me.
Hey.